In this lecture, we're going to cover the Tokugawa, also known as the Edo period, the Meiji Restoration, which is a short period, but very important transition into the modern period from about 1912. So the Edo period, I keep saying this, kind of like the Momoyama period, is very important for understanding what's going on with modern Japan. So the name, it's founded by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was the shogun for a long time, probably longer than any shogun. He becomes a shogun in 1603 and builds Edo Castle. I'll show you a picture of it. It's no longer around now. So Edo is modern day Tokyo. And Tokugawa came up with some pretty genius plans to be able to consolidate power in his hands. The first thing he did is he said that all of the daimyo, who are again feudal lords who rule over land that they control in various parts of Japan, he said, if you want to be part of my shogunate, you have to come to Edo. So he kept all of the daimyo in Edo and he built around them a pleasure district. So this is a district that had theater and music and partying and sex work and everything that they would need. And with that came all of the samurai as well. So as a result, it was very effective because Tokugawa basically took the daimyo away from their power at home, away from their advisors at home, away from their possible scheming against him, and kept them close. So if you think of if you've ever seen The Godfather 2, there's a line from one of the characters in it, or it might be The Godfather 1, from the character Michael Corleone, and he says that his father told him to keep his friends close, but his enemies closer. So this is exactly what Tokugawa did, and this was very effective. It was difficult for anybody to mount resistance against his rule because everybody was so close to him and was involved in having fun rather than things that daimyo usually do. So as a result of this, Edo had grown to one of the most populous cities in the world by the 18th century. It was 1 million people. And it's still feudal in a way, Tokyo, in that the daimyo and Tokugawa himself looked at their power and wealth in land. But for regular people, it was kind of like what we saw in the Southern Song dynasty, was a sophisticated, almost modern type of economy. There was a money economy. We saw the spread of literacy and a merchant class. So some of the art that's being made is being made instead of for elites like we've mostly seen, and for Buddhist elites and monks and such. Instead, we're seeing things made for people who are not of higher class, but were able to get some wealth or some money to be able to buy things. So the other thing that Tokugawa did, which was very effective, is he closed the borders of Japan. He saw the threat of things like Christianity and Western imperialism. He said he didn't want any of that. But he also did it to consolidate his power within Japan. So people were not allowed to travel from city to city. If you're a fan of the anime series called Samurai Champloo, it's set during the Edo period, and they talk about that all the time. The main characters are, except for one of them who's a samurai, aren't allowed to travel. They don't have documents. And they also talk about how foreigners are not allowed inside of the country. So foreigners were limited just to Nagasaki, the port, and then it was only a limited number of foreigners, mostly the Dutch. And then even then, they couldn't, they had a line that they couldn't cross at the port. And the rest of the Japanese population, you had to have special permits to even be in the port. So trying to stop foreign influence, but also trying to stop travel, where again, if people are traveling, someone could raise an army and do an uprising against Tokugawa. So during this period, we see something develop that is not a new medium, but is used in a new way. And it goes along with this economy with a lot of middle class or upper middle class, we would call them nowadays, people who have some money and have different types of art that they want to consume. So woodblock prints, which become more and more popular over the entire period. And the themes, instead of how they started, which was as a way to teach Buddhist themes, are things like Kabuki. And I'll show you, well, I'll include a link to a video on Kabuki and the Pleasure District. So this is giving an idea of what Edo looked like. This is a central area around Edo Castle. And within this area, this walled kind of city, there were 50,000 samurai and 260 daimyo. So again, keeping those enemies closer. And Edo Castle, just like we saw with the White Heron Castle, has defenses for new types of warfare. So when we talk about the Pleasure District and the sex work that's going on there, it is not the type of sex work that you would see where women have a choice. Instead, most of the people that end up in sex work are there because they were sold by their parents. So one of the effects of a money economy is that, yes, some people, if they get lucky, they can make some money, but they can also lose everything fairly easily and now have nothing to fall back on. If we get a chance to cover Japanese cinema later on, if I can figure out how to get us to see video clips, we'll talk about one of the movies that kind of discusses this and relates it to modern capitalism. So there's definitely a lot of overlap with that sort of thing. So people would literally be forced to sell their children, and that's how many women ended up in sex work. So this picture kind of illustrates it. This would be the lineup when you went to visit the brothel. You would choose who you wanted. And again, this is kind of late, so this is from the 19th century. So the samurai were reduced to administrative duties. As a result, they abandon Zen. They don't really have a need for it anymore. They're not fighting like they used to. They indulge in the pleasure district and things get kind of lost. When I talked about Zen before, and I talked about the film Ghost Dog by Jim Jarmusch, I talked about how the main character was reading this book called The Way of the Samurai. And that book was written during this period, and the person who wrote it was trying to tell the samurai, you can't leave these old ways. You have to act as we had, and kind of criticizing the people who are no longer practicing these ways and indulging in the pleasure district. So the types of activities they have would be light reading and fantasy, and they don't have the power they used to. One of the other changes that the Tokugawa shogunate made, is that previously, if you were a samurai and you had lost your master, your daimyo, you could talk to other daimyo and you could see if you could work for them. So if your daimyo dies, then you could switch to someone else. The alternative to that is you would become a ronin. And in previous times before the Tokugawa shogunate, this was a fate that was worse than death. You were better off committing ritual suicide instead. But because of the restrictions that Tokugawa did on new masters, it changed the way that people looked at Ronin, and sometimes they functioned as these types of anti-heroes. So Tokugawa said, after your daimyo dies, you can't do anything. You can't go to another daimyo. So the samurai were left with two choices. They could either commit ritual suicide, or they could become a ronin. So because so many were not able to go to new masters, many became ronin. Some of them became mercenaries. So that means if you needed protection, they would basically be your hired thugs. But there became a bunch of stories where people were thinking of the old ways and the way they act and tried to help regular people who, especially people in small towns who were getting destroyed by the economic system, which led to more crime and gangsters and such. And that's one of the themes, again, if we can go over Japanese cinema, in one of the Kurosawa movies that hopefully we'll be able to look at. So after all this, I'm going to show you something that is the culmination of the old style instead of the new styles, and then we'll go to the new style afterwards. So this is the Katsura Detached Palace. O'Reilly says the enduring Japanese interest in refinement, the reduction of their elements to their most essential forms, seems to reach its ultimate point of development in the Katsura Detached Palace. And it's still used today by the royal family. In this aerial picture, you can see how it relates to the Grand Shrine of Ise and the various Buddhist temples we looked at. We have this kind of natural area, which again, though, is landscaped. It's very refined to look like it's not refined. And the palace kind of emerges out of it like it's part of the landscape. But we can see some very ancient ideals in this that we've been talking about since the beginning of the Japanese section. So it's a country retreat for a priest. And as you approach the palace, things become less and less natural looking. But again, everything is landscaped and more precise and refined. So there isn't this, okay, we're in the woods. Now we're here in the civilized area. Instead, there's this slow transition from the wooded areas to the palace itself. So we can see that in the water where we have the rocks more and more organized, and we're getting closer and closer. The way these things are created, and you look at it from the top, and it may look very modern, or more specifically modernist, because this style of architecture was very influential to people like Frank Lloyd Wright and El Corbusier, who were some of the most important people in modern art, and also to still and all of those periods. So first thing it has is this asymmetrical. Again, one of the most ancient things that we've seen. And the asymmetry is a way to kind of fit it into a natural environment, which isn't necessarily symmetrical. And the way these are made, again, seems very modern or modernist. They are made with shoins, which are sections. It's modular. And the modules are tatami, which are 3 feet by 6 feet approximately. You can actually still buy these tatami. And this used to be a thing that mostly elite people had. A regular Japanese person's place would be just like you would see in other parts of the world, a working person. These types of tatami and modular households would be for elites only. So inside of the palace, you still have this same idea where you're flowing from the outside into the inside and coming from less organized to more organized spaces, seemingly. So these types of palaces, they want to have this flow, like we were talking about chi flow when we were talking about China. It's the same kind of idea. There's rarely fully enclosed rooms. There's non-centered windows and fixtures. And again, that's to keep chi flowing through the place. And these sliding panels can make it so you can make a room a little bit more private, but most of the time they would be open. The furniture is pretty much nothing. You might have something where you would keep some flowers. Otherwise, you would have futons that would be rolled up in these cabinets and these closets, and then you would bring them out as you need. So you would sit and sleep on the floor. And the walls themselves would be made out of most of the time, rather ephemeral materials. And part of that is because in Japan, it can get cold, but it's very temperate despite its latitude compared to most places because of I'm not a meteorologist, but I think it's because of the Pacific Current. So people do not use heat even with these very kind of like paper, sometimes literally paper walls. And that's the case even in modern Japan, especially in the country. A lot of people don't use heat. Instead, they just kind of like bundle up to stay warm. But again, it doesn't get super cold most of the time. So this is an example of how there's transitions between the natural environment outside and the more refined and less natural environment inside. So the inside flows into the outside. You can see we have these rice paper grids, and then we have these poles. So they work like columns, but they're very rustic. And the one here, it's cut into a rectangle. As we get farther and farther out, It's more like the tree was, just a solid piece of wood and even sometimes with bark on it. You can see that example here. And then these things, they look relatively refined, but again, rustic at the same time, a single piece of bamboo going across here. This furniture is from the time period. Again, it may look modernist to you because of the huge influence that Japanese architecture, Japanese elite architecture, remember, regular people don't live in homes like this, had on modernist art. So the best example to choose probably is Frank Lloyd Wright, who had been exposed to Japanese architecture with displays at various world exhibitions, one in Chicago, and actually visited Japan and tried to understand a little bit about the architecture. It fit well for similar reasons with the style of art called arts and crafts. Arts and crafts was an art movement mostly in England, but also in France, which was kind of a response to the mass production and increasingly cheap items that capitalism was producing. And a lot of them were socialists who were looking to get back to kind of an artisanal type of lifestyle where you know the person that makes the things. So to them, capitalism and the products mass production was dehumanizing. So they wanted to bring things down to human environment. But they're living in capitalism, so was Frank Lloyd Wright. So he ended up designing a lot of houses for wealthy people. One of them is this house, Falling Water, which was built for the Kaufmans. They ran a very expensive department store in Pittsburgh, where I used to live. So this piece goes along the same idea as Katsura Detached Palace. It was created on the property. They have a ton of it here, and it was created on the creek. Of course, I was born in Pittsburgh. I should say creek. That's the way they say it. And Frank Lloyd Wright told the Kaufmans, he showed them pictures of what he was doing. And they said, "Oh, you're going to run the stream right through the house?" And he said, "Yep." And they said, "Well, isn't that a bad idea? I don't think we want to do that." And he said, "Yeah, no, that's great. You want to do that, definitely." And they said, "Well, no, we don't really want to do that." And Frank Lloyd Wright said, "Well, you're doing it." So he did, and it turned out well. But it kind of shows how it's integrated in the national environment. He picked slate, especially on the outside. It's the same idea as with the Katsura Detached Palace. As you come into the interior spaces, it's a slow transition. He picked these stones to match the slate, and some of them are the actual slate that is around next to the creek. The interior, same sort of idea. We don't have, discrete spaces. Instead, we have the spaces flow into each other and a lot of natural light coming in, and even the furniture style he was influenced. And you can compare these, and they would almost be, you can imagine them being continuous in a singular structure. Obviously, different materials, but again, the idea is to match the materials that are outside. So we have the stone and falling water, and then in the Katsura Detached Palace, lots of wood and some stone. So to get to the new sort of styles that develop, one of them is the style of woodblock printing in a more genre, which is called ukiyo-e. And ukiyo-e literally means floating world, and that's why I have this little visual pun in the first one we look at. And originally, woodblock prints had been monochrome, and over time, they became full color, and now with more and more colors over time. So this became kind of a capitalist enterprise of sorts. And as just like any other enterprise, they had to compete with each other, and by creating more and more spectacular products for the market. So it developed as full color. But if you've ever done woodblock printing before, you know what the problem is. Whenever you make a print, you have to make a different block that's carved for each color. So I'm going to link to a video where you can see someone doing it in what seems to be a traditional way. But remember when you watch the video that it's not exactly traditional. He's using traditional tools and traditional techniques, but traditionally how they would be made is through an assembly line, and there'd be dozens, maybe even hundreds of workers, depending on the size of the shop, producing these things. When we look at the artist, in this case, Unomaro, we are looking at the designer of the print. Unomaro wasn't involved in the rest of the process. So watch that video and you'll see how he'll change the different blocks for each color. And each block will have what's called a register in it. That way you can line up the paper and everything is, all the colors will be where you want them to be. And I definitely wait till the end of the video because you can see how saturated and beautiful the colors are right after he's done. And there's a few prints from this time period that are preserved in that way, but not a lot. So it's a chance to kind of see an old woodblock print, but as it did when it was new. So, oh, and by the way, students always ask what kind of wood do they use? Cherry seems to be the most popular because it's got a tight grain and it's not too soft and not too hard. So it's not too chunky. So they can get some pretty good lines. Those types of themes you see in Ukiyo A, so floating world, we're talking about this kind of like ideal, a heavenly type of ideal, what you would expect to kind of what the pleasure district is selling. So two of the themes that the artist would have would be masculine and feminine ideal. So each artist would have a particular masculine ideal and a particular feminine ideal. So this is Uenomaro's. You see this face in all Uenomaro prints. So that would be a way to kind of show your individuality as an artist, but also as a trademark because you're ultimately going to sell this. And most of the artists, they practice some other type of art, which they consider to be fine art. But we'll see as time goes along that they take prints still very seriously as they would with their painting or calligraphy. So at the time, it was pretty cheap to get these prints. And even today, you can get some pretty famous prints for, that are a couple hundred years old for maybe, $700, certainly more than it was back then, which was the cost of a lunch out. So just a few dollars. And it was not thought of as high art for the elite tastemakers, but I'm not going to treat a difference between what's done here and what the artists do in other mediums. And a lot of the artists think of it that way as well. And also talk about the problems with the way that Westerners sometimes talk about what they consider to be the height of the period and how that relates to Orientalism. So there are very interesting things that are going on with prints. Because you're limited as far as you can't get modulation in color or shading, although you can do tricks to make it look modulated, you have to do other things. So oftentimes you'll see patterns mixed together, colors that don't seem to go together, and a lot of dynamism in the compositions. The figures will just stream right off of the page. Sometimes they'll also create ones where you'll get a piece of it and then, in a week, you have to buy the other piece. So if you've ever collected anime or manga and you've noticed a big picture on the spine of the books, that's where that comes from. It's kind of a marketing technique. So here we're seeing a feminine ideal. The subgenre is called Bajinga, and that just means beautiful women. And again, each artist would have a particular way of creating a beautiful woman. Over time, because most ways that you could do a face that would be kind of a standard beautiful way at the time are taken. And by the time we get to the mid-19th century, we see artists getting very creative. So we'll see an artist later on that has all of his women have crossed eyes. And again, it's because they want to use this as a trademark. So all print artists, they take on a nom de plume. So Uenomaro was born Kitagawa Ichitaro, and he was originally trained as a painter. And he had copied, like most people, the masters. And sometimes you'll see those copies are very highly valued. So you might see a Uenomaro, but it'll say Uenomaro 3. That means it's one of his, his second student who had made copies of his stuff. And then once you feel like you can do something original and you're well respected, then you take on your own name. So Uenomaro took on that name. Again, here we can see kind of the dynamic composition. There always seems to be some movement. We're getting a slither of time. Very linear. Again, it's woodblock print, so you can't control the thinness or thickness of the line, really. And patterns upon patterns. Even the cat is kind of dynamic. So this one, two geishas and a tipsy client. So geishas, I don't know about that movie that you might have seen, Memoir of a Geisha. It's not super accurate or anything like that, but there are some things in it that are pretty good. Geishas were trained to be this kind of amazing ideal, this impossible ideal, like heavenly beings on earth. So they're expected to move in a way that was almost otherworldly. They would seem to float along the ground. They'd be trained in philosophy and history and spirituality so that they could have conversations with their almost exclusively male clients about these subjects. Many Japanese elite women wouldn't be trained in this way. So for geisha, this would be a way to get a little bit more knowledge, a bit more power. And they would also be trained in dancing and music. And lastly, they would expected to be able to hold their liquor. So their clients, they're kind of partying with them and getting drunk the whole time. They're expected to be able to hold their conversation and play instruments, but the clients, not so much all the time. So again, a very dynamic composition, both in the colors and patterns, the composition, which is a big diagonal, but the way that this is a moment in time and everybody's kind of streaming off the page. Another genre is Shunga. And if you want to see some more of these, because this isn't actually the most explicit I could have picked. And what they are is exactly what you see here. Basically, what would be called pornography nowadays. But the idea of pornography, how it usually functions in the West, although it's become somewhat more accepted recently, you wouldn't, though, for instance, see like a Hollywood actor all of a sudden doing hardcore porn. So there is like kind of separation between the idea of pornography and the idea of art or other forms of entertainment. Whereas in Japan, that wouldn't be a big deal. So this is a Unimaro print, and he's doing this, and people would collect these prints, both elites and regular people, and they would just put them up on their wall. And they didn't even filter them out from children. So sex was thought to be natural, and showing things explicitly was not supposed to be a big deal. These are kind of like modern pornography, very exaggerated. We often see the genitals are huge. If you could see his penis, it would be huge as well. So kind of emphasizing the sex act. You can Google search if you want to, Shunga. There's lots of different examples. And again, if you think of modern Japanese pornography, where there's often strange kinds of censorship, that is a very modern form. It's something that comes through westernization, which we'll talk about when we get to Meiji restoration, and not something that came out of Japanese culture organically. So one of the A examples for the paper, a student had written about why how censorship had developed in Japan. So read that if you're more interested in why these things kind of happen, but you'll get an idea when we get to later periods. So another subgenre is Meisho A, which are famous places. And these are the ones that have been a little bit more famous in the West, I would say. This is Hokusai. And like the other artists we looked at, he was trained as a painter, but he also learned Japanese and Western technique. And remember when we talked about Japanese perspective, the way that it's done is generally things at the bottom of the frame are closest to you and at the top are farther away. And again, that's not how Western perspective is done, but it's very natural and easy to understand. But some of these prints, I don't have any included, but Japanese people were fascinated by Dutch paintings particularly. And you know ones I'm talking about. If you look at some of the paintings where you have a very low ground line and lots of sky and just seems to disappear forever into the background. Some Japanese artists learn this technique and put them in prints. And that's what Hokusai did, but we don't always see them in his prints. We see kind of a combination of some of the things he learned from the Western technique with some of the Japanese techniques that he knew as well. So these famous places prints were pretty popular for a really good reason. Remember, Tokugawa said that you can't travel from one town to the next, from one city to the next. So going out into the country and going for hikes, which regular people could do before this period, they couldn't do it. Upper middle class people who could use the connections, or elites who could use their connections to get travel permits, could do it. So think of these people as kind of like those upper middle class people that shop at REI, who can afford all the best stuff and go to the best places. And this would be a way for people who couldn't do this to be able to travel to see the wonderful and beautiful natural areas in Japan, which, remember, again, have been preserved despite growing urbanization through time, through the thousands of years. So most of his great work is after the age of 60, and I'll explain why. He probably didn't quite intend it that way, but you'll see. And we see something a style that we see in going back to Fan Quan in China during the Southern Song Dynasty. So a landscape of small figures. He was influenced by Sesshu. So maybe you want to take a look at these two and compare. And I'll leave that to you on the extra credit board. It would be good to understand so you can study for it, the test. But again, remember when you're thinking of the prints, you have limits to what you can do. So printmakers came up with a lot of conventions that make it easier to understand things. So I don't think anyone would necessarily perceive these white lines as actually looking like water or the top. It looks kind of flat, but we perceive it that way because of the context. So lots of kind of innovative solutions to the limitations of the medium. This one's one of my favorites. Just the way that it creates both a two-dimensional and three-dimensional image is very interesting. His most famous series is 36 Views of Mount Fuji. And how this came about was a little bit tragic. I think it was one of his nephews or a cousin had used Hokusai's name and had built up some gambling debts. And as you might imagine, gamblers are sort of gangsters sometimes, so people are after him. And Hokusai felt bad for the kid, so he basically went bankrupt, saving this kid from being executed or beat up. So he's out of money. He's already in his 60s. And he talks to his publisher and says, I got to do something big because I need the money, but also I feel like as an artist, I can stretch out a little bit. So in this one, he didn't just even though he needed the money, he didn't just go out there. He went hiking around Mount Fuji for months and did drawings from all different sides. He wanted to get unique views that people hadn't done before. And part of it's marketing, but part of it is also he's serious as an artist. He wants to have something new. When I show the students, oftentimes I don't know what to make of it so much, what's going on here. Some people perceive this part as being a path up the mountains. When I first saw it, I perceived it as lightning, and there are lots of thunderstorms around Mount Fuji. So it's hard to know. But this is the most famous print. It used to be the standard background when you bought Apple products. And that's a great wave at Kanagawa. But it's part of the 36 Views of Mount Fuji. And Mount Fuji has an interesting relationship with Japan and with the people of Edo. And people in Japan kind of see it in this way. Again, that might seem contradictory, but really isn't. It just kind of shows a balance between contrasting forces. So it erupted in 1707. I mean, it looks like a volcano. Everybody knew it was a volcano. But before that, they thought maybe it was dead because nobody had remembered or had any historical records for it erupting. So this thing, which had become kind of this symbol of solidity in eternity, exploded and moved and became dynamic. So it's on one hand, it lasts forever. So it's a symbol of immortality, but also a symbol of things changing and how great natural forces can change things in tragic ways. So this particular one shows Hokusai's study of Japanese style. So we can see that in these kind of fingers, which go back all the way, we saw it China as well. These kind of dragon claws for the wave. It's very linear. We see some interesting solutions with the the water. You can see they're just these dots, but we perceive it as foam and waves. But it also shows some of his study of Dutch compositions. So the Dutch were really interested in these mathematical, geometric types of compositions. So fractal compositions, like using the Fibonacci sequence or something like that, where you're creating a spiral that comes in. So he thought those were interesting and dynamic compositions, and he made them even more dynamic by putting them on this big, giant moving force. So the wave itself, especially this part, kind of mirrors Mount Fuji, which was still, and then it moves and it flows, but it's extremely powerful and destructive. We see the same thing with the water. It's moving and flowing all the time, but its power is eternal. So speaking of eternal, we have these men on boats, and it's a really traditional type of boat. They're not taking like one of the newer styles. And they see this great wave come. As a side note, I should mention, I saw a video a while back with hydrologists, and hydrologists are scientists. They study water and the way that water moves, and they have these labs that they make. They're basically like wave tanks. And what they can do with it is they can take these very high resolution scans that people make of ocean bottoms and bay bottoms in this case, and they can recreate it in their little wave lab, 3D print it, and then they can run water over it and see what's possible. And some of them are intrigued by this particular print. They said, well, is Hokusai exaggerating? Is this type of wave possible? So, they took it to the bay, put it in there, started sloshing it around. And yes, they said this wave is totally possible. So perhaps Hokusai had seen something like this. So the men in the boat, what are they doing? Discipline and persistence in the face of violence. What do you think? Are they going to make it when this wave hits them? Probably not. They're in trouble. But even though they're almost surely going to be capsized and maybe killed, they are showing discipline, everything that they need to do, everything that they were trained to do. So this shows a lot of these kind of thematic elements that we look at in Japan. And again, they're probably pretty ancient, the way of thinking of the ephemeral things. Life is one of those ephemeral things. It'll be gone in the next moment. So this last one was even an idea on how Hokusai thought of himself, which I think is quite beautiful. He says, if I go on trying, I will surely understand. And he's talking about paintings, and he's already in his 60s or 70s. I will surely understand them still better by the time I'm 86, so that by 90, I'll have penetrated to their essential nature. At 100, I may well have a positively divine understanding of them. While at 130, 40, or more, I will have reached the stage where every dot and every stroke I paint will be alive. So quite beautiful. Again, kind of like the previous painting where the people in the boat probably not going to make it, but they try anyway, just like our ants that we saw in the Cohen painting. And he's the same idea. Like, he's saying I'm going to live until 130, 140, and if I do, I can bring things literally alive. So he doesn't make it quite that far, because nobody does. But he dies at the age of 88, producing some of his best work in the last couple decades of his life. So this is actually kind of a good time to talk about Western views, mostly Western views of Japanese prints. I'll talk about in a minute on how they became popular in the West. But sometimes people, and when I see books written by Westerners about it, will look at Hiroshige and say he's the last of the great ones, or last of the golden age of woodblock printing. And I think part of the reason why they do that is a couple of things. First off, a lot of Western art scholars, going back to about the late 19th century, had this like kind of fetishization with simplistic things, or things that don't show a lot of emotion or aren't too intense. The idea of kind of a balance. So like when they look at ancient Greek art, they call the high classical the stuff that shows no emotion and is very balanced and not too dynamic, but just dynamic enough. And The other element I think that's going on is that Westerners often want to categorize Asian societies, in Japan in particular, as having this very kind of like austere, simple type of forms, you know, whether it's in art or in design. And I want to say that's what Japan is. But as we've seen in this class, it isn't always. We see complex things existing alongside of the simple and the rustic. And this is coming from Orientalism. It's a way for Westerners to see Japan as this kind of like circle of tradition. And obviously, people look at modern Japan and they say, "Oh my gosh, this is a highly technological culture." But that kind of leftover of imperialist designs on Japan still says, yes, they have a super modern thing, but you know, they're kind of like trapped by tradition. That's why they can never be quite as innovative. So the people that are saying this is the end of the line as far as the classic stuff, they're not consciously thinking about imperialism or trying to orientalize Japan. However, it just naturally grows out of the previous attempts of looking at non-Western cultures in this way. So needless to say, I don't agree with this. I think the stuff we're going to look at in the Meiji period, which is much more complex and dense, is very interesting. So Hiroshige is a student of Hokusai, so he's doing these Meisho A type of pictures and developing them in new and interesting ways. They call this the Yutagawa school, this style. And again, he's using perspective that is Japanese, but also incorporating some of the things that he learned from Dutch perspective. And one of the ways that Westerners got a hold of this, and there became like kind of like a trend in the 19th century, and I'll talk about exactly the political elements that led up to this in a moment. But there was a trend in the 19th century in France. It was called Japanisme, and that means kind of an obsession with Japan, like we had seen with Xinhua Suri in the Chinese section in the 18th century. And what people are interested in, again, kind of orientalizing, was Japanese ceramics. You know, they thought they were, you know, beautiful and austere and all this kind of stuff. And the Japanese people and merchants were happy to supply Westerners with these sorts of things. And as you know, like if you've ever moved before and you wanted to bring your coffee cups or whatever ceramic items you have, or if you're a ceramicist, you know this, what do? You wrap it up in pieces of paper to keep everything padded for the journey. So since prints were so widely available and so cheap and kind of the best way to get paper, people would wrap up their ceramics in these prints. And the people that are reporting them would take off their wrappings and be like, wow, these are pretty cool. So they started to try importing more of the prints. And people in France especially, but also in the United States, were exposed to these prints and were fascinated by the way that they use color and line within the limits of the woodblock genre. A lot of them, like most Westerners, orientalized Japan. They looked at them as this kind of like conflict of sophistication with simplicity. Again, you know, kind of like how modern people look at, you know, highly technological Japan, but then somehow say they're trapped by tradition. But Van Gogh, I think, was different. He highly respected what artists like Hiroshige were doing. If you read his letters, when he talks about Hiroshige and other artists, he talks about how complex and sophisticated their compositions are, their use of line, and their use of color. And he took some of those to develop his style. So he realized that in the Japanese woodblock print, since you have these black outlines, what it does with colors, and yellow was Van Gogh's favorite color, is makes them more saturated. It also means you can put like different shades of a yellow next to each other. And he also learned that by using complementary colors, blue in this case, each color will come out a little bit more. He was also fascinated by the conventions. So when you look at this painting, there's just a bunch of black lines. And I don't know if you would necessarily read that as rain. But then you look at the figures and you can read it as rain because they have their umbrellas and it looks like they're crouched down like someone would be if it was pouring down rain and trying to run across the bridge. So context makes this convention of these black lines into rain. So he basically he heard that in Japan or China, he couldn't really, at that time, he didn't have good information, that they just copied old masters to learn how to paint. So that's what he did. These characters, I doubt he got it from Japan. He might have gotten them from China. And I'm not sure if he knew what they meant either. There's better people to describe this than me. But you can see how he's using as many of the techniques as he could from Hiroshige. So in this section, I can describe Kabuki, but there's actually a pretty good video, and I'm going to link it. You can check it in the description for this video. And it'll talk about Kabuki. It's from TED. I don't like those TED Talks usually, but this one is a pretty good summary. It talks about how Kabuki was a popular theater form, how it developed from originally it was a woman who was doing these kind of like bizarre types of dances and eventually made them into stories. And then later on, women were barred from acting in the Kabuki plays that developed out of this because some of them were involved with sex work and they were using it to sell it. And then they changed all the actors to young boys, they'll explain. And then, of course, they got into sex work as well. So eventually it became all men. And the female roles and male roles are played by both men and women. And this style is completely different than the no theater that you would normally, that we had talked about before. No theater is this kind of slow motion, very refined, almost like the tea ceremony is with these masks. Whereas Kabuki is more ostentatious. It has more things going on. Like modern Kabuki plays are just, the stage is just packed. They have a stage that actually goes out into the audience. So they break down that separation between the audience and people. And the actors are very enthusiastic and, make guttural sounds. So this is perfect for the artist. The style had already developed dynamically. So the way that these posters work is, the one way is to show artists, to get different types of expressions, but also as advertising. So these would be made in the posters and you would see them in the pleasure district and, see this actor's new Kabuki play. So the way that the actors, they all do their own makeup even today. And the idea with the makeup is to show certain emotions. So the masks in no theater are usually these kind of like cold masks. There's some emotion, but not a lot, but it shows the emotion on these masks instead of you acting it. And that's the idea with the makeup. You're still acting it, but it also shows a particular emotion. So this character is sad. Been wiping his nose a lot, you can tell. And then we have other ones there, they make them look angry. So if someone's angry, they'll have like veins popping out on their head. So they have a bunch of makeup to show the veins popping out in their head. So this one shows an actor. So Hanjiro usually played women. And if I remember, maybe I'll find you some videos where you can kind of learn how they do this. But he was known as Otafuku, which means his chubby face. And if you're a theater actor, having a big head or a big face is really useful. People are sometimes far away, so if you can communicate through your face to the back of the house, that's a really good idea. And the scene that's being shown here is arigoto, which means rough stuff. So what would happen exactly here would be shibaraku, stop right there. And this line would be, it might not be those exact words, but it'd be delivered with a big guttural sound that would go all the way out to the house. And if I can find a video with some examples, this is easier to do in class in person because then I can just show you. But the artists, the actors, they'll often be many on different various parts of the stage. And the stage is huge and has a big line that comes out in the audience. So whenever this is about to come up, the actor will kind of like bob their head back and forth to get the audience's attention, then go completely still in some kind of an incredible pose, then deliver the stop right there line like that, very enthusiastically. So we can see the makeup that's being done here is the anger makeup, the aggression makeup. So the last artist in this particular section, before we get to the Meiji period, is Kunisada. This part is technically in the Meiji period. And Kunisada is a later artist, so he was running out of things to do. So his faces, everybody's got crossed eyes, but in the case of this one, even his female figures, in the case of this one, I think he's trying to show someone on the edge of madness. And I don't mean mental illness, but like someone who is aggressive and sociopathic. And people have interpreted this in many ways. It's helpful if you can read it. But it's a pimp in the pleasure district, and he is threatening one of his sex workers with damage to her livelihood, which is her face. And as you can see, another woman looks on. Other people read this as he's the muscle and this is the madam. Women could sort of kind of run brothels, and that's why she doesn't really care about this person's face getting slashed. So Kunisada, check out his pieces. You'll see even the beautiful ones, they all have the Bajinga ones, they have crossed eyes.